Charles had been lucky from birth. His parents were well-to-do, and they had thought out his path in life in great detail. He was predicted to have a diplomatic career, and he obediently enrolled in university, finding himself among the familiar circle of golden youth again. When Charles was in his graduation year, his parents had already prepared a position for him with excellent prospects. In addition, the daughter of his potential boss was offered as his wife, and Charles had already been introduced to Stephanie and her family. Why not? He thought with pleasure as he looked at the heiress of a very influential man in power. By that time, Charles had finally come to the conclusion that love was a fiction of novelists, a beautiful myth, nothing more. Stephanie matched him perfectly. She was beautifully educated, well-mannered. In a word, everything was going according to the script written by the parents. Until the meeting with Joyce. From that moment, the smooth asphalt road of Charles's life ended, and something unpredictable, enchanting, incomprehensible, but exciting began. One day, he was walking lazily down the avenue, waiting for Stephanie, who was late again. Next to a street artist's exhibit stood a tall young woman with waist-length curly hair, playing her violoncello with inspiration. She was out of the picture of reality, as if she were from some other world. She didn't care whether anyone listened to her or not, though there was an open case at her feet, in which Charles had already noticed were quite a few bills. Next to it was a handwritten sign: "The money will go to help the homeless." The sign made the man skeptical, because it was clear that the money would not go to any homeless people. It was just a scam. But these disgusting thoughts did not associate at all with the girl, with the music and the way she played. Charles paused to watch the scene that surprised him. Suddenly he was curious why she was not afraid that the money would simply be taken away while she played with her eyes closed, immersed in the magical world of music. It would only take a second for a street thief to run up and grab everything. Apparently, she had protectors and wouldn't be so careless otherwise. The hunch turned into a certainty when a tough guy with the habits of a typical bandit appeared nearby. The girl had just taken a short break, and seeing the young man, she smiled and waved at him. He nodded briefly and disappeared into the crowd. Charles decided that he could afford a small donation to the homeless, especially since the girl played beautifully as far as he could judge. He laid a large bill next to smaller denomination bills. However, the girl, even if she noticed his generosity, did not demonstrate her surprise, but simply thanked him. Feeling a little disappointed, Charles stepped aside, and a few minutes later Stephanie appeared, and they went to the next party. Stephanie was not in the mood today. She was nagging at little things, criticizing everyone and everything, so Charles didn't get any pleasure in meeting her and was only glad when she finally went home. The next day, Charles went again to the place where he had seen the charming musician the day before. After standing around for a while, he asked an artist where the girl with the violoncello had gone. "Did you like her?" The artist winked understandingly, excited about the chance to chat. "She's working at the shelter tonight." Charles was embarrassed by yesterday's thoughts because it turned out the girl was really collecting money for the homeless. He decided to get additional information and asked, "And where exactly is this shelter?" The painter looked at the man warily and shook his head. "I wouldn't even think about it if I were you. Joyce is no match for you. There's a legend around here that she's the illegitimate daughter of a crime boss, but I think it's something else. She helps many people. Maybe she saved someone powerful. It's an entirely different world, dark, with its own laws. But one thing I can say for sure, she has a clear soul. Such as she is 1 in a million. I even painted a portrait of her. I wanted to sell it, but then kept it. Here, look." A small portrait, more of a sketch made in charcoal, was in the corner hidden from public view. At that moment, the light fell on the paper in a peculiar way, because Charles thought he saw an angel, a luminous, sublime, angel of music. "Do you understand?" the artist asked quietly, and Charles nodded, fascinated by what he saw. "Does she know about the painting?" he asked, finally struggling to take his eyes off the image imprinted on paper. The artist shook his head. "I'm going to give it to her for her birthday." Charles talked a little more with the artist and finally found out the address of the shelter. The shelter was quite far from downtown. Charles could not explain even to himself why he decided to meet the mysterious Joyce and what motivated him. But soon he stepped over the threshold of the house, the signboard of which said, "Home of Mercy Hope." Inside the shelter was a mixture of hostel and train station. People who decent society tried to ignore were lying or sitting everywhere. "Excuse me, where is Joyce?" asked Charles to a very young woman who was walking towards him with a tray full of neatly sliced bread. Completely unsurprised by the question, and not even specifying which Joyce he was talking about, the girl waved her hand somewhere to the right. Charles looked in the pointed direction and indeed saw Joyce, surrounded by children. She was gesticulating, saying something and laughing merrily. The children were answering her with the same bursts of laughter and coming closer. Charles realized that Joyce was telling them a fairy tale, composing the story right on the spot, and the children helped to invent it, making their own adjustments. He must have had a strange look, as she immediately paid attention to him and suddenly asked if he could do magic tricks. Charles shook his head. The children chattered in disappointment, and Joyce, who lost interest in him instantly, turned away, ready to continue the story. "But I can juggle," said Charles to rehabilitate himself in the eyes of the children, and in a minute a tennis ball, a toy hedgehog, and some other little things that the children found in their pockets flew up into the air. The children were delighted, and Joyce's eyes warmed, and that was enough to make Charles feel really proud. Having finished the performance and bowed out, he looked at the girl feverishly, thinking of what to say to her, but she helped him out of the awkward situation. "Children, play for a little. In a while we will bring you something delicious." Charles followed her to the large table with trays. He did many things that evening. He helped to bandage the leg of an old man with a black eye and listened to the life story of an elderly woman who claimed to be a former actress. Joyce seemed to have to be in several places at once, helping, prompting, comforting. She found a kind word for everyone and always had a smile on her face. Charles never once noticed an expression of squeamishness or disgust, although many of the inhabitants here were dirty and nasty. Charles even began to itch himself just looking at the unwashed and beaten by life people. He couldn't imagine Stephanie being here, even in his wildest imagination, and Joyce surprised and fascinated him. Women like her became nurses of mercy in the past. They saved the wounded and gave water to the dying. "We can go home now," said Joyce, and looked at Charles. "You can join us if you'd like. Volunteers are always welcome, but something tells me you won't come here again. I'm a good judge of people." At first, Charles wanted to object, but he didn't want to lie, so he just admitted that he was here for her. Joyce was surprised, and he told her that he had wanted to meet her after he heard her play on the avenue. "I have to go home. It's late, and to be honest, I'm tired. I live not far from here," the girl said at last. Charles asked if he could accompany her, and Joyce agreed. They were walking along the night city, and Charles wondered why he had previously declined the pleasure of a simple walk, admiring the streets, the trees, the passers-by. "Thank you, Charles. I'll walk the rest alone. Good night," said Joyce, and smiling farewell, disappeared into the depths of the backyard. Charles was returning home, thinking about what he had experienced today, and regretting that he had not even asked her for her phone number. Suddenly someone called out to him from behind. Charles turned around and saw two dark figures. "Are you talking to me?" he asked, because no one else was around. Of course, to you. Listen, man, get out of here and don't let us see you around Joyce again. Charles became nervous. For the first time in his safe and conflict-free life, he was confronted with brute force. There were two of them, and they were definitely stronger than he was. All right, said Charles, and he ran away, accompanied by mocking laughter and whistling. At home, finally regaining his spirits, he thought for a long time about why he got involved in this story. Yes, Joyce was wonderful, but he had Stephanie, who was offering a prosperous future. Charles held out for a week. During that time, he had quarrelled with his potential bride 3 times and increasingly caught himself thinking how much she annoyed him. Stephanie seemed to behave as usual, only now Charles perceived all her statements and actions very differently. On Saturday, he gave up for good and went to an avenue, where he found Joyce at the same place. The girl nodded at him without breaking off from her playing and continued with her concert. When she finished her program, Charles approached, getting ready to explain his absence, but Joyce spoke first. Hi, could you please help me? I need as many reposts of one ad as possible. Of course, said Charles, not surprised at all. It was quite in Joyce's nature, and he didn't care that a few minutes after he posted the ad, that started with the words, "A missing person," he was bombarded with questions from his friends as to why he had decided to do such nonsense. Joyce also played in various cafes, collected money for the dog shelter, and generally managed to help everyone who was in need. At the same time, she also studied at medical college and worked part-time at the Children's Hospital as a nanny. Charles was never tired of being amazed by her energy. He had the impression that the more energy she gave, the more energy returned to her. He never saw her once depressed or in a bad mood. She never grumbled or fretted. She always smiled and was rushing to help someone. Charles continued to come to her street concerts, remembering to put a large bill in her violoncello case. He must have relaxed in his fascination with her, because Stephanie was increasingly making scenes, and communication with her, reduced to a minimum at his initiative, had become a burden. Only his natural cowardice was preventing him from finally breaking up with his capricious girlfriend. He knew that his parents would not like such a change, and he delayed any decision. As a result, he was helped, and in an extremely harsh way. "Stop right there!" 2 shadows grew out of the darkness as Charles whistled his way home. Charles thought feverishly about what to do. "Well, hello there," the tall one hummed, shoving his hands in his pockets. His buddy twisted Charles's arms behind his back in a swift grab and pressed something cold against his chin. Charles went cold. He had never felt how much he wanted to live before. His heart was beating like crazy, the blood pounding in his temples. "Please don't," he said and almost choked. "We warned you to leave Joyce alone, but you didn't listen. Now do you understand that we weren't joking?" said the tall one. Charles barely nodded, afraid of getting hurt. "Maybe we'll decorate the face of this macho. Why should we believe him?" asked the man who was holding Charles. The tall one spat on the pavement and said, "That's certainly possible, but what if they're in love? Hey, buddy, tell the truth. Do you love Joyce?" "Yes," he whispered. "And would you marry her?" The tall bandit continued his interrogation. Charles swallowed. His voice was almost gone, and he mumbled, "Yes, of course." "Well, that's good," the tall one finished in a peaceful tone, and in the same second Charles fell to the ground, and the 2 bandits disappeared into the darkness. Charles took a frantic gulp of air and staggered home on trembling legs. Only when he closed the door behind him did he finally believe that he was safe. He drank a gulp of cognac and curled up under a blanket, feeling the tension of the last few minutes letting go a little bit. At the same time, he felt completely aware that he had told those bandits the absolute truth. Yes, he wanted Joyce to be his and only his. The decision was made, and Charles fell asleep, feeling himself a different man. Resolute, courageous, strong. Joyce, marry me. The words came easier than he had anticipated. The woman looked at Charles carefully, as if weighing what she had just heard. Meanwhile, he took the box he had prepared and gave it to her. There was a thin, very elegant ring. Joyce smiled. What a beautiful ring. Tell me, are you sure you have thought it over? You know, this is very serious. I understand. Charles wanted his words to sound as convincing as possible. Yes, I've made up my mind. I love you, and I want you to be my wife. Joyce was still smiling, listening to something deep inside herself. You believe in what you say, she finally said. I've fallen in love with you too, Charles, but I have a feeling that your parents will mind. Charles imagined for a moment what a scandal would happen in his noble family, but determination did not leave him. I think we have the right to decide what we want. It's our life. Maybe this is my first independent step in my life, and I intend to do it, regardless of my parents' opinion. Joyce looked intently at him, and Charles saw surprise and even admiration in her eyes. I've thought of everything. I've almost finished university. I'll find a job, rent an apartment, and everything will be fine. Joyce still kept her eyes on him. She seemed to be struggling inside. She still had doubts. You know, a family is a serious thing for me. I'm an orphan from childhood. I have dreamed that I would have a beloved husband, children, a shaggy dog with a wet nose. Only now did Charles realize that he knew nothing about Joyce's past, and the version about the criminal boss's father seemed to be untrue. But now Charles decided not to ask her more questions, considering it tactless. If she'd like to, she'd tell him herself, and if not, it didn't matter. The main thing was to be together. So, will you marry me? Repeated the man as he took the ring out of the box. Joyce hesitated for only a second and then offered her dainty finger. The ring fit perfectly, and suddenly Charles felt surprisingly comfortable and good in his heart. On the same day they applied for a wedding license, and the only thing that upset him was the necessity to wait a whole month more. Now there was one more thing to do: break up with Stephanie. So you're saying you're breaking up with me, aren't you? Stephanie repeated to Charles for the third time, blinking her perfectly made-up eyelashes. Try to understand me and forgive me. It happened, no one's guilty, but I met another woman and I fell in love with her. Charles was still hoping to part peacefully. I don't love you, and you don't have any high feelings for me either, and you know it. Our parents decided to marry us because it would be convenient for them. How can you agree to that? What if you meet someone you will really love too? Why should we deprive ourselves of a chance of happiness? So you're dumping me, aren't you? Stephanie repeated. Charles was beginning to be terribly annoyed by this. It was impossible to be such an impenetrable fool. He was already grateful 100,000 times to fate for saving him from such a bride. Yes, I'm leaving you. Charles finally decided to end diplomacy, since she didn't understand otherwise. You're going to regret this. Stephanie burned the man with a fierce look and slapped him in the face. Her long fingernails scratched his cheek, but Charles was willing to endure more than that, just to get this woman out of his life. Stephanie went to the door and left, slamming it as hard as she could. But the sequel followed an hour later. Charles's father called and shouted menacingly, "What are you doing there, you idiot? Apologize to Stephanie immediately and convince her to come back." Charles listened to his father and habitually felt his heart clench at his father's commanding voice. He had been afraid of him since childhood. As soon as he started yelling, Charles would cower in a corner and start whimpering until his mother calmed them both down. She had always been a real diplomat's wife. But now Charles seemed to be possessed by a demon of contradiction. What right did his father have to dispose of his life and decide for him? "I'm not going to apologize. It's my life, Dad." For the first time in his life, Charles dared to contradict his all-powerful father. "Oh, then I'm going to—" But the father didn't finish because the mother replaced him. "Son, Daddy got nervous. I'm sorry. I think we all need to talk. Come with your girlfriend for dinner tomorrow night, and we'll have a family conversation." This turn of events surprised Charles, but he decided it was better than yelling at each other, so he agreed. Joyce was pleased to hear the news, and by the appointed time she had dressed up, put her hair in an elaborate style, and was so pretty that Charles couldn't get enough of her. His mother welcomed them on the doorstep, and his father greeted them cordially, constantly joking and making florid compliments to Joyce. Nothing reminded him of yesterday's conversation, and dinner went great. Joyce was on every subject, and was so nice that Charles was convinced that she was perfect. They were preparing to leave when his mother said, "Why are you taking a cab? Let's call Father's driver." Charles hesitated for a second, but the temptation to take Joyce for a ride in his father's company car won out. In the car, the young woman put her head on Charles's shoulder, and with a sigh of relief she said, "You can't imagine how afraid I was of this meeting, but they seemed so good." "If only you knew what happened last night," thought Charles, but he didn't say anything out loud. The evening really was amazing and not worth overshadowing. He hugged Joyce and froze from the overflowing tenderness. In the rearview mirror, he caught the driver's gaze. He seemed to be smiling. The car drove smoothly through the evening city. Charles had drunk a little, and probably for this reason he felt a little dizzy and uncontrollable, craving sleep. His eyes closed by themselves, and he drifted off, hearing Joyce's steady breathing near his ear. And then darkness set in. "Doctor, he's opened his eyes." Charles heard his mother's voice. Sounds came through cotton wool. Charles could not feel his own body, and his thoughts were confused. "What's wrong with me?" was all he could say. "Hush, please don't say anything to him now," he heard his mother's voice again. The foreboding of something terrible squeezed his heart. Charles tried to sit up, but caring hands put him back on the bed. "Joyce, where is Joyce?" he whispered, but his eyelids became heavy, and Charles drifted off into a heavy sleep and saw Joyce there. She was standing in the middle of a field of yellow dandelions, playing the violoncello with inspiration. Charles rushed toward her, but his feet were tangled in the grass. He could not take a single step, and Joyce was moving farther and farther away from him. And then the dandelions turned white and soared into the air, covering his beloved. "Joyce!" Charles shouted as hard as he could, but there was no one in the place where his fiancée had just stood. "Wake up, you need to eat," said a woman's voice. Charles opened his eyes and struggled to focus on the pretty face of a woman in a nurse's uniform. Caring hands lifted his head. A spoon seemed near his mouth. Charles mechanically swallowed, not feeling the taste. Suddenly, he became angry. "Don't treat me like a baby. Where am I? And what happened?" His own voice seemed unfamiliar to him. "You're in the hospital. You're on the mend, and your mother asked me to let her know when you finally come to your senses," replied the nurse, and left the room, gently closing the door behind her and leaving the man in utter confusion. What had happened? Why didn't he remember anything? His mother arrived half an hour later and immediately asked him how he was feeling. "Fine, just a little dizzy, Mom. I don't remember anything. Why am I here?" His mother arrived half an hour later and immediately asked him how he was feeling. "Fine, just a little dizzy, Mom. I don't remember anything. Why am I here?" His mother looked at her son carefully, as if assessing how much truth he was capable of accepting. She sat down next to him, took his hand, and gathered her courage to tell him everything. "You were in an accident. The car crashed. You hit your head hard." "And where is Joyce? I want to see her." It seemed to Charles that he was shouting, but in fact his voice barely rustled in the silence of the room. "You need to get some sleep," his mother said, and suddenly Charles was terrified. "Is Joyce okay? What ward is she in?" "She's not in a ward, son." She seemed to make up her mind. "You see, you're the only one who survived the accident. You have to accept it. You have to move on." His mother sighed and held out the ring to the dazed son, and Charles recognized it the second he saw it, and recoiled as if it would sting him. "We buried her while you were unconscious. She had no family." Mum kept stroking her son's hand. "You will recover, and we will visit her grave together." Charles suddenly began to rush around in bed like a wounded animal, and the nurses immediately entered the room and injected him with a sedative. Several days passed as if he were in a fog. Charles woke up and went back to sleep, obediently swallowed pills, ate a few spoons of something tasteless, and fell back into a stupor. His parents were visiting him. Once he even thought he saw Stephanie, but he didn't care. Nothing made any sense anymore. Charles's parents were very concerned that their son was taking so long to come to his senses. "Unfortunately, medicine is powerless here," the doctor shrugged. "He is practically healthy. It seems that his mind refuses to accept the pain of his girlfriend's death and protects him in this way. All we can do is wait." The doctor was right. In the condition that Charles was in now, he could see Joyce alive and cheerful. They would talk for hours. He would sit on the edge of the bed, and they would make plans for the future, laugh, argue, kiss, and fall asleep snuggled up against each other. The vision always vanished as soon as Charles woke up, and he wished with all his might that he could go back to the place where they could be together. But the young body was slowly recovering. Soon the feeling of hunger returned, and once Charles was able to get out of bed and overcome his dizziness, he made his way to the toilet on his own. Surprisingly, Stephanie constantly came to the hospital, along with his mother, and at first it annoyed Charles. And then he was ashamed of what he had done to the woman who had worried so much about him. At a family meeting, it was decided to send Charles to recover in a summer house by the sea. Blissful peace, silence, sea air, forest. This place really seemed like paradise, when Charles could be alone with his unhappy thoughts. One day Stephanie arrived, and they took a long walk and talked as they had done when they first met. The young woman brought all sorts of goodies and books for study. She persuaded him to eat, cheered Charles up, and besides his parents, was the only thread connecting Charles to the outside world. She was just beside him, not insisting on anything or demanding. The flighty girls seemed to have been replaced. Without noticing it, Charles had become attached to her. More and more often, the thought that perhaps his parents were right, and they really were perfect for each other, crossed his mind. One day, his mother cautiously asked Charles if he wanted to visit Joyce's grave. He shuddered with horror, and she quickly said, hurrying to make amends, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to upset you. I just want you to know she's being taken care of. Daddy made the arrangements, and they've already put up a memorial and clean it up regularly. We'll go there later, when you feel better." Charles nodded, knowing that it would never be better. He wanted to leave the city more than anything, and when his father brought up the prospect of working in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the capital, Charles was unspeakably happy. The father hesitated a little and asked what Charles thought about the prospect of going there with a wife. "You know, every job has its nuances. With a wife, you'll get a wholly different status, and you can count on a quicker promotion." Of course, Charles was well aware of this, and at that point, his relationship with Stephanie had strengthened, and he agreed. The wedding was played in a pompous manner. There were many guests on both sides, and in the midst of all of this splendour, there was a beautiful bride in a snow-white dress. I did the right thing. It's impossible to live in the past only. Joyce would have minded if I had decided to bury myself with her. Charles convinced himself, gently touching Stephanie's warm lips. Soon they left for the capital, and in the turmoil of business and worry, Charles was finally able, if not to forget, then at least to give himself a break from the grief that was pressing down on him like a grave slab. Stephanie felt like a fish out of water in this new environment. She quickly made the right acquaintances and was happy to go on with her usual life. Charles attended receptions with her, made acquaintances, smiled, shook hands, and tried to earn a good reputation with his superiors. He even succeeded in this until he accidentally saw a short TV report shot on the very same avenue where he had first seen Joyce. Familiar musicians, artists, and a portrait of Joyce, so lively and spirited. That evening Charles got drunk and saw her again in his dreams. "Why didn't you look for me? Don't you love me any more?" asked Joyce sadly, leaning her head slightly sideways and looking at him. "What are you talking about? I will always love you," Charles hotly protested. "Then why didn't you search?" Joyce repeated. "I was so scared. I'm sorry I couldn't come to your grave. It was too much for me." He tried to justify himself, but Joyce only shook her head in response. "Why did you betray me?" Charles was awakened by his own scream, scaring Stephanie to death. He had to explain that he was having a nightmare. His worried wife insisted that he go to the doctor. Charles was prescribed a sedative, and everything stopped for a while. However, as soon as he relaxed, Joyce came to him again in his dreams. Now she wasn't accusing at all, just standing there and watching, and for some reason, that was the scariest thing for Charles. If she had accused him again, he could at least object. But she was silent. The pills were not helping much. Charles first increased the dose and then switched to stronger medicines. He would probably have drunk himself to death if it were not for fear of losing his job. Stephanie was the first who noticed his condition. Without further ado, she made Charles pack his things and go to the hospital for treatment. Another 6 months passed after the treatment. One day, Charles happened to run into his father at the central office. The man looked great despite his years. They talked, drank coffee, and parted contentedly. His father got into the car, and Charles caught a glimpse of the driver. His heart raced. He was the same driver who had driven him and Joyce home that awful day. But his parents had said he was the only survivor. For the first time, doubts crossed Charles's mind, and he called his mother. "Son, you must be mistaken," she said, and her voice sounded so convincing that Charles realized his mother was lying. After hanging up the phone, he contacted an acquaintance from the security service and asked to know if the car and the driver were in the database. The answer stunned him. It turned out that there had been no accident. Charles could not stop wondering what else they had lied about. He had been deliberately separated from Joyce, and he would never forgive them for that. With trembling hands, Charles opened a bottle and poured the pills into the palm of his hand. He didn't want to live any more. But he was saved, and this time he spent 2 weeks in the hospital. On the day he was discharged, there was a surprise. At home he found a note from Stephanie. "You can do what you want with your life, but I will not let you ruin mine. I am filing for divorce." Further events proceeded at breakneck speed. Charles was fired from the service. He packed up his belongings and the rest of his money and left for his hometown. When Charles called his father, He scornfully told his son to deal with his own problems and hung up on him. Charles realized that from that moment he had become persona non grata to his parents. Trouble seemed to have no end. Money was running out, and soon he had nothing left to pay the rent. Finding a job was not easy either. Perhaps someone had tried very hard to make the most unflattering comments about his person become public. Former classmates did not answer the phone, and soon Charles took every opportunity to earn at least a little. Even now, when doubts were literally gnawing at him from the inside, he did not try to find Joyce. Even if she were alive, she certainly did not need such a coward and slacker. Meanwhile, the quagmire of continuous bad luck sucked him deeper and deeper, and so the day came when he had nowhere even to spend the night. There were no other options, and his feet led Charles to the very shelter he had visited with Joyce. Fate, after all, is a great mocker. Now it was his turn to gratefully accept a plate of hot soup and a glass of tea from the hands of a pretty girl volunteer. "It must have been hard for you." An overgrown, bearded man looked at him sympathetically from the bunk next to him. Any other time Charles would probably have walked away from the conversation, but now he just needed the companionship. "Yeah, life was unfair," Charles admitted, grateful for the sincere sympathy in the stranger's voice. "Don't feel sorry for yourself," said the bearded man. "The test is not given to man in vain. The weak in spirit will fall, but the strong will endure and be able to grow over himself." The bearded man smiled, and his face became clear and joyful for a moment, and Charles saw hope in his eyes. The bearded man smiled again and then lay down on his bunk, covered his head with a blanket, and snored. Charles was once again alone with his thoughts. Suddenly someone called his name. He turned around and saw a girl who was staring at him. With difficulty he recognized the teenage girl he had run into many times when he was here with Joyce. "Charles, what are you doing here?" she asked in amazement. "It just happened," was all Charles could say, not knowing how to explain anything to her. "You disappeared so suddenly then?" The girl sat on the stool with a clear desire to talk. "Yes, there were circumstances," answered Charles grudgingly. "I've been ill for a long time, and now I'm here." "Wait a minute." The girl quickly searched her pockets and handed him a business card. "Here you go. They'll help you with a job for sure. The director, one of our former volunteers, founded a charity and has already helped many people. Try your luck tomorrow. Maybe you'll get a chance." Charles had a thought that luck was not about him, and looked at the business card without interest. The charity centre. Joyce. He read the inscription and his eyes went dark. Fortunately, the kind girl had already left, and no one saw him crying silently, covering his head with a thin blanket. In the morning, Charles went to the given address. A woman greeted him and invited him into her office. The name on her name tag was Mary. She looked through the papers for a while, clicked the computer mouse, and then smiled and asked, "Charles, tell me honestly, are you really ready to work in our centre? And have you any idea what kind of people you will have to deal with?" Charles nodded, and Mary asked if he had any experience of dealing with people who were turned away from society. "Very little. I volunteered at another centre, but only for a short time. That's where I got your card. Your resume says that you graduated from the School of International Relations and are trilingual. Do you think you could teach?" Charles admitted that he had never tried, but was sure he could do it. "Different people come to us, some with children. You see, our director, Mr. Wright, was brought up in an orphanage, and he considers taking care of children his top priority. Let's do it this way. We'll put you on probation, and of course the director will decide in person. By the way, he's getting married today. It's such a romantic story, you can't imagine." The secretary smiled and told Charles everything she knew. The director and his future wife were from the same orphanage. He was like a brother to her, though he had loved her all his life, only he would not admit it. He looked after her, helped her with everything, and then she fell in love with some rich man. He made a fool of her, promised to marry her, only his parents were against it. Can you imagine how terrible people can be? I don't know the details, but it seems she was kidnapped and kept under lock. The groom turned out to be a coward and left her, and Mr. Wright, thanks to his friends, tracked down Joyce. Everything turned out great in the end. Joyce was rescued and they finally decided to get married right here today. Mary looked at Charles in triumph. "What's wrong with you? You look pale. Can I get you some water?" "No, it's okay. It'll pass," said Charles with difficulty. Mary looked at him carefully and then resolutely pulled out a drawer and took out a few bills. "This is an advance salary and you can live in the centre. I'll show you your room. Be sure to come to our assembly hall. Everyone will gather there for the wedding." Leaving his few belongings in the room, Charles went to the avenue. He found the artist in the same place, who recognized Charles and then listened attentively to everything he confusedly explained. Charles apparently succeeded in touching the artist's heart, because he returned to the centre with a small package. He had already made his decision. There was still one more, perhaps the most important, challenge of his life. The hall turned out to be a huge, spacious room equipped for performances, events, and watching movies. Now all the free space was filled with tables, with food and drinks. There were plenty of people gathered there. Charles was easily able to get lost, taking a place in the very corner behind the column. From here, under reliable protection, he saw a couple entering the hall to the applause. A tall, rather thin man in an elegant suit, and a bride in a lovely wedding dress, as if woven from unweighted lace. Her face was covered by a veil. She stepped so easily, as if she was floating on air. Charles could not take his eyes away from her. His heart felt it was she, Joyce, alive and real. When the groom threw back the veil to kiss the bride, Charles was speechless. She was incomparably beautiful. It was the face of an angel of kindness and mercy, mistakenly left on a sinful earth. Charles did not know there was such pain. They kissed and their heart bled, but he continued to watch, memorizing every feature of the woman he loved. She hadn't changed a bit. She remained as beautiful and spirited. This was how the street artist had depicted her on the portrait, which Charles had left among other wedding gifts. Tomorrow she would open the package and read the inscription on the back of the picture. "Forgive me, Joyce. Forgive me, and be happy." Charles's thoughts were drowned out by the thunder of applause and the cheers of the guests. He took advantage of the commotion to get out of the hall, grabbed his things, left the room key on the empty entrance counter, and walked toward the train station. The money was enough for a ticket, and now the fast train was taking him farther and farther away from his former home, from his former life to the new yet unknown one. Charles decided to go far north. Who knew, maybe there in the north he would be able to cool the burning pain of memories. "I'm sorry, kind woman Mary. I'll surely pay you back from my first earnings," promised Charles, looking at the disappearing outlines of his hometown. 7 years passed. The northern lights illuminated the whole area. At that time, a sturdy, bearded wood ranger came skiing out of the woods. A dog ran out after him and raced across the field to the nearest house. With a smile, Charles followed him, and in a few minutes he heard children's voices. It was his children, the twins, playing with the dog, and on the porch Charles's wife, the very Mary to whom he owed a debt, was waiting. Years ago, after earning his first money, Charles wrote her a letter thanking her and sending her a transfer. Their correspondence continued, and eventually the two lonely people found each other and created a strong family, which they were infinitely happy and joyful about.